Soon after France surrendered to the Germans in June 1940, a resistance organisation began to sprout all over the country. Eventually, the French resistance would number between 75 and 220,000 patriotic men and women, many of whom gave their lives in the struggle to liberate their country. But for every patriot who took up arms, there were hundreds or thousands who simply went with the flow and grudgingly accepted occupation. And there was also a small minority who, for a variety of reasons, decided to collaborate with the Germans, some even joining the German armed forces and taking up arms against the Allies. The most controversial of these units was the French SS, or to give it its full title, the 33rd Waffengrenadier-Division Charlemagne, named for the famous King of the Franks and Emperor who united most of Western and Central Europe in the early 9th century. So why did young Frenchmen fight for the Germans? Some had been members of pre-war far-right political parties that admired Hitler and Mussolini. Some hated communism more than German occupation and were prepared to take up arms in what they saw as a Europe-wide crusade against Bolshevism. Some were anti-Semites, some were opportunists. And these Frenchmen were not alone in collaborating. The SS would end up with units of Norwegians, Danes, Dutch, Belgians, Estonians, Latvians, and Croatians, to mention just a few, and even a tiny British unit recruited from POW camps. The first French collaborationist unit was not SS. In October 1941, a French infantry regiment, 2,500 men strong, was recruited and crossed the Soviet frontier on the 22nd of June 1942 during Operation Barbarossa. In spring 1942, the French had been reorganized into the Légion Voluntaire Francaise of 5,800 men and was used to fight partisans in the Eastern Front rear areas. In June 1943, the two battalions of the LVF were reunited as a single regiment and served in Ukraine until officially disbanded on the 1st of September 1944. The SS, however, was always eager for recruits to circumvent recruitment restrictions placed upon it by the army, and enlisting foreigners was the easiest way to fill out its ranks. The SS had started recruiting Frenchmen aged between 20 and 25 who fulfilled Nazi racial tests. By July 1944, 1,700 men had been trained, and the unit, the French SS Volunteer Assault Brigade, was sent to the Eastern Front. It sustained heavy losses in combat and was withdrawn and sent to Danzig. Soon after, men from the army's LVF joined the unit, which became the Waffengrenadierbrigade der SS Charlemagne. After further training at Wildflecken and more recruiting, the French SS became a small division. By this stage, the Battle of France was almost over, with the Western Allies having pushed the Germans back to the borders of the Reich. The division, just 7,340 men, was nonetheless populated by many experienced soldiers and many ideological followers of Hitler and the Nazis. Sent to fight the advancing Soviets in Poland on the 25th of February 1945, it was badly mauled in Pomerania by elements of the Soviet First Belarusian Front. 2/3 of the division was killed or captured, with only a third managing to be evacuated by the German Navy to Denmark, and then was sent to Neustrelitz for refitting. In early April 1945, under the command of SS-Brigadeführer Dr. Gustav Krukenberg, a German lawyer and experienced SS combat officer, 700 men were reorganized into a single infantry regiment of 2 battalions, plus a heavy support battalion. The situation in Berlin was, by the time of Hitler's last birthday on the 20th of April 1945, critical. Soviet forces had broken through the last substantial German defences east of the city at the Seelow Heights in a 3-day battle, and on the 20th came close enough to fire artillery into the eastern suburbs. They would start to encircle the city and fight through towards the central government district that contained the Reichstag building and the Reich Chancellery, with Hitler's bunker beneath. Krukenberg released 400 of his men to construction units, and taking the hardcore 350 volunteers, decided to get to Berlin and join the fight after receiving a message on the 23rd of April from the beleaguered Reich Chancellery. The unit was organized as Assault Battalion Charlemagne. Incredibly, as the Frenchmen assembled in the marketplace of the town of Austrelitz, a large armoured limousine drove past. Krukenberg and his men snapped to attention, for the car contained none other than Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler himself. Unbeknown to Krukenberg or Hitler in Berlin, Himmler was returning from a secret meeting with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross in Lübeck, as he continued to try and surrender Germany to the Western Allies, with himself as interim leader of Germany. Himmler's car did not stop. Krukenberg and about 350 men managed to get to central Berlin on the 24th of April. It was not a straightforward journey. The men travelled in 2 Kübelwagens and 9 heavy trucks. 2 of the trucks didn't make it. The remaining men entered the northwestern suburbs at Nauen shortly before the encirclement of the city by the Red Army. They drove to the Olympic Stadium in Charlottenburg, helping themselves to piles of supplies abandoned by the Luftwaffe. Krukenberg drove on to the Reich Chancellery for orders. The Charlemagne was organized into a small headquarters staff under SS-Hauptsturmführer Henri Fenet and 4 rifle companies, each of 60 to 70 men. They moved east to Neukölln and were attached to the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland. On the 25th of April, Krukenberg was appointed Commandant of Defence Sector C and also took over command of the shattered Nordland Division, itself composed of Norwegian, Danish and Dutch regiments. On the 26th of April, the French SS and the Nordland mounted counterattacks in the Neukölln district of southeast Berlin, supported by King Tigers of Schwere SS Panzerabteilung 503. The French SS suffered 50% casualties on the first day. The remainder dug in to defend Neukölln Town Hall. The situation was hopeless. Krukenberg pulled the French and the Nordland back to prepared positions around Hermannplatz. The Nordland and the Charlemagne were in almost constant combat as Soviet tanks and infantry assaulted their positions. In vicious street battles, French SS and some Hitler youths armed with Panzerfaust anti-armor weapons knocked out 14 Soviet tanks. The stubborn resistance actually held up the Soviets for 48 hours in this sector. However, the immense advantage that the Red Army enjoyed in men, tanks and artillery support meant that Krukenberg's forces were pushed back into the central government sector, where the last stand would take place among the shattered government buildings and monuments. On the 28th of April, Krukenberg established a forward headquarters in a subway carriage at the Stadtmitte U-Bahn station. In 4 days of frenetic fighting, the SS Charlemagne alone had destroyed 62 Soviet tanks out of 108 knocked out in southeast Berlin. Captain Fenet had established the Charlemagne command post in the Reich Aviation Ministry on Wilhelmstrasse. By now wounded, Fenet received the Knight's Cross from SS-Brigadeführer Wilhelm Mohnke, commanding the central government district, while 2 other Frenchmen were also decorated for destroying Soviet tanks by Krukenberg at his underground headquarters, the Stadtmitte railway station. SS-Unterscharführer Eugene Vollo had knocked out 2 Soviet tanks during the defense of Neukölln and 6 more using Panzerfaust during the fighting around the Reich Chancellery. On the 29th, Krukenberg awarded him the Knight's Cross and awarded the Iron Cross First Class to SS-Untersturmführer Roger Albert Bruno for knocking out 4 tanks earlier that day. In total, on the 29th to 30th of April, Fenet and his men knocked out 21 Soviet tanks. The French SS continued to defend positions on Friedrichstrasse, Belle Allianceplatz and Wilhelmstrasse. The final battles for the central government buildings commenced as Soviet forces stormed each massive block in turn, fighting room to room. Hitler died on the 30th of April, but the fighting in Berlin went on, German forces well aware of what awaited them on surrendering. This was especially true of foreign SS like the Charlemagne, who were wanted men in France. Fenet's remaining men defended the Reich Chancellery area. On the night of the 1st to 2nd of May 1945, a general breakout was ordered. The surviving German units in the city centre attempted to break through the Soviet cordon and retreat west to surrender to the Americans or British. By now, the SS Charlemagne had been reduced to about 30 unwounded men. Some made it, but many were killed or captured. Early on the morning of the 2nd of May, the Red Army captured the ruined Reich Chancellery, and at 6 a.m., General Helmut Weidling, Berlin battle commandant, surrendered at his bunker headquarters at the Bendler Block and was taken to the Soviet lines, where at 8:23 Weidling ordered the city surrendered. Brigadeführer Krukenberg, though not French, was nonetheless tried by the Soviets after managing to hide out in Berlin for a week after the surrender. He served 11 years in prison before being released and died in West Germany in 1980, aged 92. Captain Fenet, who commanded the Charlemagne during the fighting in Berlin, managed to escape the city with the remainder of his unit and surrendered to the British at Bad Kleinen. Fenet and several of his men were turned over to the Red Army. 12, who were turned over to the French by the US Army, were shot as traitors. Fenet was released by the Soviets, but rearrested in France. In 1949, a court sentenced him to 20 years forced labour, but he was released early in 1959. He died in Paris in 2002 at the age of 83. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. And also visit my new audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.